The October wind rattled the windows of the Victorian house on Maple Street as Mark Thompson climbed the creaking stairs to his late grandmother's attic. Dust particles danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through a grimy window, and the air carried the musty scent of decades-old memories. 3 months had passed since Grandma Helen's funeral, and Mark had finally found the courage to sort through her belongings. Cardboard boxes lined the cramped space, each one labeled in his grandmother's careful handwriting: Christmas decorations 1967, Dad's army photos, recipe cards. Mark wiped sweat from his forehead despite the October chill. As a technology journalist for the Des Moines Register, he was used to tight deadlines and stressful situations, but something about this attic felt different, oppressive. "Just get through this," he muttered to himself, grabbing a box marked Family Photos, Miss Key. The cardboard felt soft with age, threatening to collapse as he carried it to a folding table beneath the window. Inside, hundreds of photographs spilled out like scattered memories, black and white images from the 1940s mixed with faded color prints from the 1980s. Mark recognized some faces: his grandfather in his Navy uniform, his mother as a young woman, various relatives at Christmas gatherings, but many were strangers, their identities lost to time. He was about to close the box when a particular photograph caught his eye. The image was sharper than the others, professionally taken with crisp focus and perfect lighting. The date stamp in the corner read September 15th, 1980. A 12-year-old girl with auburn hair stood in front of Cedar Falls Elementary School, her green eyes staring directly at the camera with an unsettling intensity. But it wasn't the girl's haunting gaze that made Mark's blood run cold. It was what she held in her small hands. The rectangular black device was unmistakable: sleek edges, a dark screen, and what appeared to be a circular home button at the bottom. Mark's hands began to shake as he held the photograph closer to the window, squinting at the impossible image. The girl was holding what looked exactly like an iPhone, but the first iPhone wouldn't be released for another 27 years. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Mark whispered, but his journalist's eye told him otherwise. The photograph showed no signs of tampering. The girl's reflection was visible in nearby windows. The shadows fell correctly, and the image quality matched other photos from the same era. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. It was his editor, Janet, probably calling about his overdue article on smart home security. He let it go to voicemail, unable to tear his eyes away from the impossible photograph. He flipped the image over, hoping to find some explanation written on the back. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Sarah Mitchell, age 12, always such a strange little girl, H." The handwriting was definitely his grandmother's, but Mark had never heard her mention anyone named Sarah Mitchell. He grabbed his laptop from his bag and began searching online databases for any record of Sarah Mitchell in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The search yielded dozens of results, but none matched the girl in the photograph. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the attic floor, Mark made a decision that would change his life forever. He carefully placed the photograph in his briefcase, along with a few other images from 1980. Whatever the truth behind this impossible picture, he was going to find it. The wind picked up outside, causing the house to groan and settle. As Mark packed up the remaining photographs, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around the empty attic but saw nothing except shadows and dust. Still, the sensation persisted as he made his way downstairs, the mysterious photograph burning a hole in his briefcase, like a secret too dangerous to keep. Mark's home office in downtown Cedar Falls buzzed with the blue glow of multiple monitors as he worked late into the night. His apartment, a converted loft above Murphy's Diner, usually felt cozy, but tonight it seemed to close in around him. The photograph of Sarah Mitchell lay beside his keyboard, taunting him with its impossible contents. He had spent the last 4 hours scanning the image at the highest resolution possible, using professional-grade equipment borrowed from the newspaper's photography department. Every pixel told the same impossible story: a 12-year-old girl holding advanced technology that wouldn't exist for decades. "Come on, give me something," Mark muttered, adjusting the contrast and brightness settings. He had enhanced crime scene photos before, revealed hidden details in corporate scandal images, but nothing had prepared him for this. As he zoomed in on the device in Sarah's hands, his breath caught in his throat. The enhancement revealed details that made his scientific mind rebel against what he was seeing. The device had a distinctive rounded rectangular shape with what appeared to be a metallic frame. Most disturbing of all, the screen wasn't completely black. There seemed to be a faint interface visible, with what looked like app icons arranged in a grid pattern. Mark's coffee grew cold as he worked, cross-referencing the image with historical photos of 1980s technology. Transistor radios, early calculators, primitive handheld games. Nothing matched the sleek design of the device Sarah held. He pulled up images of the first iPhone from 2007, placing them side by side with his enhanced photograph. The similarities were undeniable and terrifying. His phone rang at 2:17 a.m., startling him from his obsessive focus. The caller ID showed his ex-wife's number, but when he answered, only static filled the line. Strange. Lisa never called this late, especially not since their divorce 2 years ago. "Hello, Lisa?" Mark said into the phone, but the static continued for several seconds before the line went dead. Shaking off the unease, Mark returned to his analysis. He opened photo forensic software, the kind used by law enforcement to detect digital tampering. The program ran for 20 minutes, analyzing every aspect of the image for signs of manipulation. When the results appeared on screen, Mark's hands began to tremble. Image authentication. Genuine. No signs of digital alteration detected. Timestamp verified. September 15th, 1980. Mark leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Either this was the most sophisticated hoax in history, or he had stumbled upon something that challenged the very nature of time and technology. He decided to take a different approach. Opening a new browser window, he began researching Sarah Mitchell more thoroughly. Cedar Falls was a small town. Someone had to remember a girl who disappeared or died young. The local newspaper archives online only went back to 1995, but the Cedar Falls Historical Society might have older records. As Mark reached for his phone to make a note about visiting the Historical Society, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The photograph of Sarah Mitchell, which he had left beside his keyboard, was no longer where he had placed it. It now lay several inches to the right, as if someone had picked it up and examined it while he worked. Mark lived alone. He had locked his apartment door when he came home. The windows were on the 3rd floor, and he would have heard anyone climbing the fire escape. "I must have moved it without thinking," he told himself, but his journalist's instincts screamed otherwise. He had developed an almost photographic memory for details, a crucial skill in his profession. He clearly remembered placing the photograph to the left of his keyboard, oriented vertically. Now it lay horizontally to the right. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something else. In the reflection of his computer screen, he could swear he saw movement behind him. Mark spun around in his chair, heart pounding, but found only the familiar shadows of his apartment. The clock on his monitor showed 3:33 a.m. Mark saved his work and closed the forensic software, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah Mitchell was somehow watching him through that decades-old photograph. The 12-year-old girl's green eyes seemed to follow him as he moved around the room, preparing for bed. As he reached to turn off his desk lamp, Mark noticed one final disturbing detail. The timestamp on his computer showed that someone had accessed his email account at 3:15 a.m. while he had been working on the photograph analysis. The accessed message was his own sent folder, specifically an email he had sent to a technology historian 3 years ago about vintage handheld devices. Mark checked his apartment door. Still locked. Windows still secure. Yet somehow, someone or something had been using his computer while he sat just inches away. The impossible photograph of Sarah Mitchell lay on his desk, her enigmatic smile seeming wider than before, the iPhone in her small hands gleaming with an otherworldly light that shouldn't exist in 1980. The Cedar Falls Historical Society occupied a restored Victorian mansion on 3rd Street, its gingerbread trim painted in cheerful yellow and white. But as Mark approached the building on this grey October morning, the cheerful facade seemed to mock the dread growing in his chest. He had barely slept after the strange incidents in his apartment, and every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the Society's elderly curator, greeted him with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her pale blue eyes. She was perhaps 75, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and liver spots dotting her hands like ancient maps. "Mr. Thompson, how lovely to see you," she said, leading him through rooms filled with antique furniture and historical displays. "I was so sorry to hear about your grandmother, Helen. She was a dear friend and a generous supporter of our work here." Mark followed her to a research room lined with filing cabinets and bound volumes of local records. The musty smell of old paper filled the air, mixed with something else, a faint ozone scent that reminded him of electrical storms. "I'm researching a young girl who lived here in 1980, Mark said, pulling out the photograph. "Sarah Mitchell, age 12. My grandmother had this picture, but I can't find any records of her online." Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from her face and her hands began to shake as she stared at the image. She sat down heavily in a wooden chair, one hand pressed to her chest. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "From my grandmother's attic. Do you know Sarah Mitchell?" Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, her eyes darting between Mark's face and the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of buried secrets. "Sarah Mitchell died in 1980, she said slowly. September 15th, to be exact, the same date as this photograph. Mark felt the room grow cold around him. How did she die? Nobody knows for certain. She simply vanished. One day she was walking to school and the next she was gone. They found her body 3 days later in Miller's Creek, but there were no signs of violence, no explanation for what happened. Mrs. Hartwell stood and walked to an old filing cabinet, her movements stiff with age and apprehension. She pulled out a manila folder and returned to the table. "This is everything we have on the Mitchell case," she said, opening the folder to reveal newspaper clippings, police reports, and several more photographs. Mark's heart stopped. There, among the official documents, were 3 more photographs of Sarah Mitchell, all taken on different dates in 1980, and in each one she held the same impossible device. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mark said, his voice hoarse, "in these pictures, what is Sarah holding?" The old woman's eyes grew distant as if she were seeing something far beyond the walls of the Historical Society. That's what made the case so strange. Everyone who saw those photos asked the same question. Some said it was a calculator, others thought it was a radio. But it didn't look like anything that existed back then. She pointed to one of the photographs, dated August 1980. This was taken at the county fair. Sarah's parents brought it to the police, hoping it might help find her. But look at the people in the background. They're all staring at her, at that thing she's holding, like they knew something wasn't right. Mark studied the fair photograph. Indeed, the adults in the background wore expressions of confusion and unease, their attention focused on Sarah and her mysterious device. "What happened to her parents?" Mark asked. "The Mitchells left town right after the funeral. Couldn't handle the memories, they said. But before they left, Mrs. Mitchell came here to donate some of Sarah's belongings." Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "She told me something strange. She said Sarah had been acting differently in the weeks before she disappeared, talking about things that hadn't happened yet, knowing about people she'd never met." A chill ran through the research room, and Mark noticed that the lights had begun to flicker intermittently. Mrs. Hartwell noticed too, her eyes growing wider. "There's something else," she said, reaching into the folder and pulling out a handwritten note. "This was found in Sarah's bedroom after she disappeared. She wrote it the night before she vanished." Mark took the note with trembling hands. In a child's careful cursive, Sarah had written, "The man from the newspaper will come looking for me someday. Tell him the phone shows what's coming, not what was. Tell him I'm still here, still waiting." The temperature in the room plummeted, and Mark's breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Mrs. Hartwell wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving Mark's face. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "you're the first person from a newspaper to ever ask about Sarah Mitchell. How could she have known you would come?" Before Mark could answer, every light in the building flickered and died. In the darkness, he heard Mrs. Hartwell gasp. When emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting eerie shadows throughout the room, Mark saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, looking exactly as she had in the 1980 photograph, 12 years old, auburn hair gleaming, green eyes filled with an ancient wisdom that no child should possess. In her small hands, she held the impossible device, its screen now glowing with an otherworldly blue light. Mrs. Hartwell's scream pierced the emergency-lit darkness of the Historical Society, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around them. Sarah Mitchell stood motionless in the doorway, her 12-year-old form casting no shadow, despite the harsh backup lighting. The device in her hands pulsed with that unnatural blue glow, casting dancing patterns on the walls. Mark's journalistic training kicked in, overriding his terror. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to document this impossible encounter, but the device remained completely black, unresponsive to his touch. The temperature continued to drop, and his breath came out in visible puffs. "Sarah?" he whispered, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The girl's head tilted slightly, her green eyes focusing on him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his soul. When she spoke, her voice carried the strange echo of someone speaking from a great distance. "You found the photographs," she said, her words carrying a subtle electronic distortion, as if filtered through old speakers. "I knew you would. I've been waiting so long." Mrs. Hartwell had pressed herself against the far wall, her face pale with terror. "This isn't possible," she gasped. "Sarah died 35 years ago. I saw the funeral." Sarah's attention shifted to the elderly curator, and something like sadness flickered across her youthful features. "You remember me, Mrs. Hartwell? You were younger then, working at the library. You helped me with my school project about time." "The time project?" Mrs. Hartwell whispered, recognition dawning in her eyes. "You asked such strange questions about paradoxes and causality. Questions no 12-year-old should know to ask." Mark stepped closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. "Sarah, what is that device you're holding? How did you have it in 1980? The girl looked down at the glowing rectangle in her hands, and for a moment her expression became deeply sad. "It's not from your time or mine. It came from somewhere else, somewhere between." The device's screen suddenly flared brighter, and images began to flash across its surface, rapid-fire glimpses of events that made Mark's head spin. He saw newspaper headlines from years in the future, faces he didn't recognize, technologies that didn't exist. And through it all, Sarah's reflection stared back from the screen, unchanged, eternal. "I found it by the creek," Sarah continued, her voice growing fainter. "The day I died. It was just lying there in the mud like it was waiting for me. When I picked it up, I could see things, terrible things that were going to happen, beautiful things too. I saw you, Mr. Thompson, long before you were even born." The room seemed to pulse with each beat of Mark's heart. Dust motes in the emergency lighting moved in impossible patterns, swirling around Sarah like a gentle tornado. "Why me?" Mark asked. "Why am I here?" "Because you're the one who can tell the story," Sarah replied, stepping closer. With each step, her form seemed to become more translucent, as if she were fading back into whatever realm she had emerged from. "The device shows truth, but truth needs a voice. It needs someone who won't be afraid to share what they've seen." Mrs. Hartwell found her courage and stepped forward. "Sarah, dear, what happened to you that day? How did you die?" The girl's expression grew infinitely sad. "I saw what the device would do to the world if it stayed in the wrong hands. I saw wars fought with weapons that don't exist yet, privacy destroyed, minds enslaved to glowing screens. So I tried to throw it in the creek, to bury it where no one would find it." She paused, looking down at her small hands. "But it wouldn't let me go. It had bonded with me somehow, become part of me. The only way to keep it safe was to take it with me, to exist between moments, between life and death." The blue light from the device began to flicker, and Sarah's form became increasingly transparent. Mark realized she was running out of time. Whatever force that had allowed her to manifest was weakening. "Wait," he called out desperately. "There has to be more. Why are you showing yourself now? What's changed?" Sarah smiled sadly, and for a moment, she looked like any normal 12-year-old girl. "Because it's time for the device to return. Technology has caught up to what it showed me in 1980. The world is ready for what it contains, and you're the one who must decide what to do with that knowledge." The device in her hands pulsed one final time, blindingly bright, and then both Sarah and the glow vanished. The emergency lights flickered back to normal, and the temperature in the room began to return to normal. On the floor where Sarah had stood, a single object remained, a sleek black rectangle that looked exactly like a modern iPhone, but felt impossibly ancient in Mark's trembling hands. Mrs. Hartwell sank into her chair, her face ashen. "Dear God, what have we witnessed?" Mark stared at the device, his reflection visible in its dark screen. For just a moment, he could swear he saw Sarah's face looking back at him from within the glass, her lips moving in a warning he couldn't hear. The Historical Society felt different now, charged with an energy that made the hair on Mark's arms stand on end. He carefully wrapped the device in his jacket, knowing that his life had just changed forever. Sarah Mitchell had waited 35 years to pass this burden to him, and now he had to decide what to do with technology that existed outside of time itself. Mark's hands trembled as he drove home through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, the mysterious device wrapped in his jacket on the passenger seat. Every streetlight seemed to flicker as he passed, and his car radio crackled with static that almost sounded like whispered voices. The October afternoon had turned grey and oppressive, with low-hanging clouds that threatened an early winter storm. Back in his apartment, Mark placed the device carefully on his desk, afraid to touch it directly. It looked exactly like a modern iPhone, but something about its weight and texture felt wrong. Too heavy, too smooth, as if it were made from materials that hadn't been invented yet. For 2 hours he stared at the black screen, afraid to activate it. Mrs. Hartwell had gone home early, claiming she felt ill, but not before making Mark promise to call her if anything strange happened. As if anything about this situation could get stranger. At exactly 6:33 p.m., the device came to life on its own. The screen illuminated with that familiar blue glow, but instead of a normal interface, symbols appeared that Mark didn't recognize. Not quite hieroglyphics, not quite circuit diagrams, but something that seemed to shift between languages as he watched. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the symbols faded, replaced by a standard iPhone home screen. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The apps were all familiar: phone, messages, camera, settings, but they felt somehow different, as if they were facades hiding something far more complex underneath. Tentatively, he reached out and touched the Messages app. The screen filled with conversations, but none of them made sense. The names in the contact list were people Mark had never heard of, and the timestamps showed dates ranging from 1980 to 2087. He scrolled through messages that discussed events that hadn't happened yet, technologies that didn't exist, and personal dramas involving people who might not even be born. One conversation thread caught his attention. It was between Sarah Mitchell and someone listed as the Guardian, their most recent exchange dated just minutes ago. Sarah: "He has the device now. I think he's ready." The Guardian: "Are you certain? The last 3 Guardians didn't survive the transition. The knowledge is too much for most minds to handle." Sarah: "Mark is different. He's a truth-seeker by nature. If anyone can handle what the device shows, it's him." The Guardian: "Very well. But remember, once he sees the full timeline, there's no going back. He'll know things that could drive him insane." Sarah: "He deserves to choose for himself. The world is running out of time." Mark's heart pounded as he read the exchange. He was being discussed as if he were part of some cosmic plan he didn't understand. His finger hovered over the keyboard, and almost without conscious thought, he typed a message. "Mark: Sarah, are you there?" The response came immediately. Sarah: "Hello, Mark. I was wondering when you'd figure out how to use the messaging function." Mark: "What is this thing? What am I supposed to do with it?" Sarah: "It's a window, Mark. A way to see across time and space, but it's also a responsibility. The device chooses its guardians carefully." Mark set the device down, his hands shaking. Through his apartment window, he could see storm clouds gathering, and lightning flickered in the distance despite the absence of thunder. The weather seemed to be responding to the device's activation. Curiosity overcame his fear, and he opened the Photos app. The gallery was filled with images that made his blood run cold, photographs of events that hadn't happened yet. He saw newspaper headlines announcing wars, natural disasters, technological breakthroughs. He saw his own face, older and worn, standing in front of what appeared to be a congressional hearing. One photograph made him gasp aloud. It showed Cedar Falls Elementary School, but instead of the familiar brick building, it was a twisted ruin of metal and glass, surrounded by emergency vehicles and crowds of people. The timestamp on the image read November 15th, 2025, just 3 weeks from now. Mark's regular phone rang, startling him from his horrified fascination. The caller ID showed his editor, Janet, but when he answered, it wasn't Janet's voice he heard. "Mark Thompson," said a voice that was unmistakably male and carried a strange electronic distortion. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Who is this? How did you get this number? The device you're holding is dangerous in the wrong hands. Bring it to the old Miller's Creek Bridge at midnight. Come alone or the consequences will be severe." The line went dead, leaving Mark staring at his phone in confusion and terror. He looked back at the mysterious device, which had started displaying a countdown timer on its screen. 5 hours, 26 minutes, 43 seconds. As he watched, the timer ticked down relentlessly. At the bottom of the screen, a message appeared in red text. "Temporal cascade event imminent. Guardian decision required." Mark opened the Messages app again and frantically typed to Sarah. "Mark: Someone called me. They want the device. There's a countdown timer. What's a temporal cascade event?" The response came quickly, but it wasn't from Sarah. The Guardian: Sarah can no longer help you, Mr. Thompson. She used the last of her energy to manifest at the Historical Society. Now it's up to you to decide the fate of your timeline. Mark. What happens if I give up the device? The Guardian. Reality unravels. Every person who has ever touched the device, every event it has influenced, becomes unstuck in time, including you. Mark. And if I keep it? The Guardian. You become its eternal guardian. Like Sarah before you, you exist between moments, watching over the timeline, making sure the future remains stable. It's not a life any human should have to live. Thunder finally rumbled overhead, and rain began to patter against the windows. Mark looked at the countdown timer, 5 hours, 22 minutes, 17 seconds, and realized that in a few short hours he would have to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of time itself. The storm outside Mark's apartment intensified as he delved deeper into the device's contents. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, and the lightning strikes grew more frequent, each flash illuminating his face in stark, haunting detail. The countdown timer now read 4 hours, 47 minutes, 12 seconds, its red digits pulsing like a digital heartbeat. Against his better judgment, Mark opened the camera app. Instead of showing the view from a normal camera, the screen displayed what appeared to be live feeds from different times and places. He could see Cedar Falls Main Street, as it looked in 1955, bustling with vintage cars and people in period clothing. With a swipe, the scene changed to the same street in what appeared to be 2030, dominated by sleek electric vehicles and buildings that defied conventional architecture. But it was the third view that made his blood run cold. The camera showed his own apartment, but from an impossible angle, as if the device were floating near the ceiling, looking down at him sitting at his desk. In the feed, he watched himself discover the camera function, creating an infinite loop of observation that made his head spin. Mark quickly closed the app, his hands shaking. The device seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence, as if it was studying him as much as he was studying it. He opened the Notes app, hoping to find more information about what he was dealing with. The first note was titled Guardian Protocol, Emergency Instructions, and was written in Sarah's handwriting. If you're reading this, then I've successfully passed the device to you, and you're probably terrified. Good, you should be. This device doesn't just show the future, it shapes it. Every decision you make while holding it creates ripples through time. The countdown timer appears when reality is approaching a critical junction point. Someone or something is trying to alter the timeline in a way that could have catastrophic consequences. You have until the timer reaches 0 to either prevent the alteration or accept the role of guardian permanently. The voice that called you belongs to Dr. Marcus Webb. In 1979, he was part of a secret government project called Temporal Dynamics. They were trying to create technology that could predict and prevent future disasters. Instead, they created something that could unmake the very fabric of time. Webb has been searching for the device for decades. He believes he can control it, use it to reshape history according to his vision of perfection. He's wrong. The device will consume him just as it consumed the others who tried to master it. Remember, Mark, the device chooses its guardians for a reason. Trust your instincts. Mark's phone rang again. This time the caller ID simply read unknown, but he knew who it would be before he answered. Mr. Thompson. Dr. Webb's electronically distorted voice carried an edge of impatience. I trust you've been exploring the device's capabilities. Fascinating, isn't it? The power to see across time, to witness the consequences of every choice before it's made. What do you want with it? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I want to fix the world, Mr. Thompson. That device has shown me the mistakes humanity will make, the disasters we could prevent, the wars we could stop before they begin. Give it to me, and I can create a perfect timeline where suffering is eliminated. And what happens to free will? To the natural course of history? Webb's laugh was cold and mechanical. Free will is an illusion when you can see all possible outcomes. History is chaos. With the device, I can impose order. Mark looked at the countdown timer. 4 hours, 31 minutes, 8 seconds. What happens if I don't meet you? Then at midnight, I activate the temporal destabilization field I've been building for the past 30 years. It will create a cascade effect that rips the device from your reality and places it in mine. Unfortunately, the process will likely destroy several city blocks and kill thousands of people, but that's a small price to pay for the greater good. The line went dead, leaving Mark staring at the device in horror. He quickly opened the Messages app and typed to the Guardian. Mark, Webb says he has a temporal destabilization field. Can he really do what he's threatening? The Guardian. Dr. Marcus Webb was brilliant before the temporal research drove him insane. Yes, he can do exactly what he's threatening. The device has been sending him visions for decades, just as it sent them to Sarah. But where Sarah chose sacrifice, Webb chose obsession. Mark, how do I stop him? The Guardian. There are only two ways this ends. Either you meet him and face the consequences, or you accept the role of Guardian and step outside of linear time. As Guardian, you would have the power to stop him, but you would lose your humanity in the process. A new message appeared. This one from Sarah. Sarah, Mark, I need you to know something. I wasn't the first Guardian, and if you choose this path, you won't be the last. There are dozens of us, scattered across different points in time, all holding reality together. It's lonely, but it's necessary. Mark typed back frantically. Mark, there has to be another way. Some option that doesn't involve me losing my life or letting thousands of people die. Sarah, maybe there is. The device has never bonded with a journalist before. You're trained to find the truth, to see patterns others miss. Perhaps that's why it chose you. The apartment suddenly fell silent. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. The countdown timer stopped at exactly 4 hours, 30 minutes, and the screen changed to show a single message. Guardian Choice Protocol activated. Temporal junction analysis complete. New path available. Below the message, 3 options appeared. 1. Meet Doctor. Webb, risk high, probability of success 23%. 2. Accept guardianship, risk personal obliteration, probability of success 95%. 3. Unknown path, risk cannot calculate, probability of success unknown. Mark stared at the third option, his journalist instincts telling him that the unknown path might be exactly what Sarah had hinted at. The device had never before offered a third choice to a potential guardian. With trembling fingers, he selected unknown path. The screen went white, and suddenly Mark wasn't in his apartment anymore. Mark found himself standing in what could only be described as the space between seconds. The world around him was frozen in perfect stillness. Raindrops hung motionless in mid-air. Lightning bolts painted static streaks across the sky, and through his apartment window, he could see people on the street below, locked in mid-stride like living statues. He was no longer in his apartment, but rather in a vast library that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The shelves contained not books, but glowing orbs of various colors, each one pulsing with its own internal light. Standing before him was Sarah Mitchell, but not as the 12-year-old ghost he had encountered at the Historical Society. This Sarah appeared as she might have looked had she lived to be his age, with auburn hair streaked with silver and eyes that held the wisdom of decades spent watching over time itself. "Welcome to the Nexus," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong without the electronic distortion he had heard before. "This is where all Guardians come, when they need to see the bigger picture." Mark looked down at his hands and saw that he still held the device, but here it appeared as a simple glass sphere filled with swirling galaxies. "What happened? How am I here?" "You chose the unknown path. No Guardian before you has ever had that option, because no Guardian before you has been a seeker of truth by profession. The device recognized that your unique skills might allow for a solution we've never considered." Sarah gestured to the shelves around them. "Each of these orbs contains a timeline, a possible version of reality. The Guardian's job is to maintain the stability of the prime timeline while preventing paradoxes and temporal disasters." Mark approached one of the shelves, drawn to a particularly bright blue orb. As he touched it, images flooded his mind, a version of reality where the internet was never invented, where humanity developed along a completely different technological path. He jerked his hand away, overwhelmed by the flood of information. "That's the timeline Dr. Webb wants to create," Sarah explained. "In his version of reality, he guides humanity's development from the shadows, preventing wars but also stifling growth, creativity, and the very struggles that make us human." "And the red orbs?" Mark asked, noting several shelves lined with crimson spheres. "Those are the timelines where Webb succeeds in taking the device by force. In most of them, his temporal destabilization field destroys not just cedar falls, but creates a cascade effect that unravels reality itself." Mark walked deeper into the library, and Sarah followed. "You said I have unique skills. What did you mean?" "You're a journalist, Mark. You're trained to find connections, to see patterns, to ask the right questions. Look around this library and tell me what you notice." Mark studied the arrangement of the orbs more carefully. At first they seemed randomly placed, but gradually he began to see a pattern. The brighter orbs were clustered together in certain sections, while darker orbs formed distinct groupings elsewhere. And there, in the very center of the library, was an empty space where an orb should have been. "There's a missing timeline," he said slowly, "right in the center, where the most important one should be." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Mark saw genuine hope in someone's eyes. Exactly. That's the timeline that should exist, but doesn't. The original timeline, before the device was created, before temporal manipulation became possible. But how can we restore something that never existed? "That's where your third path comes in," Sarah said, leading him to a reading desk where several orbs were arranged in a complex pattern. "Every guardian before you has faced the same choice: sacrifice themselves to maintain the current broken system, or let reality collapse. But you found the question none of us thought to ask." Mark stared at the empty space where the missing timeline should have been. What if the device itself is the problem? What if the solution isn't to control it or guard it, but to eliminate it entirely? Precisely. The device exists outside normal time, which is why destroying it in the conventional sense is impossible. But there might be another way. Sarah picked up one of the orbs from the desk. This one was clear crystal with a single point of light in its center. This is the moment the device was first created. In 1979 at the Temporal Dynamics Laboratory, Dr. Webb and his team were trying to build a quantum computer capable of calculating future probabilities. What went wrong? They succeeded too well. The computer didn't just calculate possibilities, it began to exist in all of them simultaneously. It became unstuck from linear time, and its influence began spreading backward and forward through history. Mark understood. So to eliminate the device, we need to go back to the moment of its creation and prevent it from becoming temporally unstuck. Yes, but it's not that simple. The moment you take the device back to 1979, you create a paradox. If the device is never created, then you never would have had it to take back in time to prevent its creation. Mark felt a headache building as he tried to wrap his mind around the temporal mechanics. "So what's the solution?" Sarah handed him the crystal orb. "You don't take the device back to 1979. You take yourself back, armed with the knowledge of what's going to happen. You become the intervention that prevents the device from being created in the first place. But won't that change everything? Won't that erase all the people whose lives were affected by the device's existence?" "No," Sarah said softly, "because those people will have lived their lives in the original timeline, the one that should have existed all along. You'll be restoring the natural order, not destroying it." Mark looked at the crystal orb in his hands, feeling its weight and warmth. "What happens to you and the other guardians if I do this?" Sarah's expression grew peaceful. "We finally get to rest. We get to live the lives we were meant to live before the device pulled us out of time." Through the vast windows of the Nexus Library, Mark could see the frozen storm still raging over Cedar Falls. The countdown timer, visible even here, showed 3 hours, 52 minutes, 18 seconds. "If I do this," Mark said, "if I go back to 1979, will I remember any of this?" "Some of it, maybe. Enough to do what needs to be done. The universe has a way of preserving the knowledge necessary for its own survival." Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. "How do I get back to 1979? Sarah smiled and gestured toward a doorway that hadn't been there moments before. Beyond it lay not another room, but what appeared to be a swirling vortex of colors and lights. "Step through that doorway, and you'll emerge in the Temporal Dynamics Laboratory on October 31st, 1979, 1 hour before the experiment that creates the device. But Mark," she paused, her expression growing serious, "once you cross that threshold, there's no coming back. You'll be committed to seeing this through to the end." Mark looked back at the library of timelines, at all the possible futures spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. Then he looked at the empty space where the original timeline should have been, waiting to be restored. "Tell me one thing," he said to Sarah. "In the original timeline, the one where none of this temporal manipulation ever happened, do you live?" Sarah's smile was radiant. "I grow up, become a teacher, marry a good man named David, and have 3 children. I live to be 87 and die peacefully in my sleep, surrounded by grandchildren." That decided it. Mark stepped toward the doorway, the crystal orb warm in his hands and the device tucked securely in his jacket. As he reached the threshold, Sarah called out to him one last time. "Mark, remember, the device was created because Dr. Webb wanted to eliminate uncertainty from the world. Show him that uncertainty, that the unknown is what makes life worth living. With that wisdom ringing in his ears, Mark stepped through the doorway and into the swirling vortex of time itself. Mark materialized in a supply closet filled with the acrid smell of developing chemicals and ozone. Through the thin walls, he could hear the excited chatter of scientists and the electronic hum of sophisticated equipment. A glance at his watch showed 10:47 p.m., October 31st, 1979. The familiar weight of the device in his jacket seemed heavier now, as if it were resisting being brought back to the moment of its own creation. He cracked the closet door open and peered into a sterile hallway lined with government-issued fluorescent lights. The Temporal Dynamics Laboratory was housed in a nondescript building on the outskirts of Des Moines, but Mark could feel the electric anticipation in the air. Tonight was the night that would change everything, unless he could prevent it. His clothes had somehow adapted to the era during the temporal transit. He now wore a brown corduroy jacket, dark slacks, and a tie that screamed late 1970s. More importantly, he carried a leather briefcase that contained documents identifying him as Dr. Martin Thompson, a quantum physicist from MIT sent to observe the experiment. The memories weren't entirely his own, but they were there. Enough knowledge of 1979-era physics and government protocols to navigate this situation. The universe, as Sarah had promised, was providing him with the tools he needed. Mark stepped into the hallway and followed the sound of voices toward the main laboratory. The scene that greeted him was like stepping into a science fiction movie from the era. Banks of primitive computers with reel-to-reel tape drives, oscilloscopes displaying complex waveforms, and at the center of it all, a metallic chamber, roughly the size of a phone booth connected to hundreds of cables. A younger Dr. Marcus Webb stood before a control panel, his dark hair unmarked by the gray Mark had seen in recent photographs. Even at 35, Webb's eyes held an intensity that bordered on obsession. He was surrounded by a team of 6 other scientists, all focused on banks of monitors displaying streams of data. "Gentlemen," Webb announced to the room, "in 13 minutes, we will successfully predict the outcome of next Tuesday's gubernatorial election with 100% accuracy. The temporal calculation engine will demonstrate that the future is not random, but entirely deterministic." A woman with short blonde hair, Dr. Patricia Chen, according to Mark's implanted memories, looked up from her calculations. "Marcus, the power readings are fluctuating beyond our projected parameters. Maybe we should delay the test." "Absolutely not," Webb replied sharply. "We've been preparing for this moment for 2 years. The Department of Defense expects results, and we're going to deliver them." Mark approached the group, his forged credentials ready. "Dr. Webb, I'm Martin Thompson from MIT. I was sent to observe tonight's experiment." Webb barely glanced at him, too focused on his instruments. Fine. Just stay out of the way. We're making history tonight." Mark positioned himself where he could see both the temporal calculation engine and the main control panel. The device in his jacket was growing warm, and he could swear he heard Sarah's voice whispering urgently, though the words were too faint to understand. "Beginning final calibration sequence," Webb announced. The room filled with a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate in Mark's bones. The primitive computers around the room began processing at maximum capacity, their tape drives spinning frantically. Mark watched the chronometer on the wall, 10:57 p.m. In less than 4 minutes, the experiment would begin, and the device would come into existence, trapping Sarah and countless others in an endless cycle of temporal guardianship. "Dr. Webb," Mark called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what they were dealing with. "I need to speak with you privately. It's urgent." Webb shot him an annoyed look. "This is hardly the time for interruptions, Dr. Thompson. It's about temporal paradoxes," Mark said, using the one phrase he knew would get the physicist's attention. Specifically, what happens when a quantum calculation system becomes unstuck from linear time. Webb's hands froze on the controls. "How do you know about that?" "That's classified theoretical work." Mark pulled the device from his jacket, and every person in the laboratory stopped what they were doing. Even in 1979, the sleek design was unmistakably advanced, but more than that, it seemed to bend the light around it in ways that hurt to look at directly. "Because I'm from the future, Dr. Webb. I'm from a timeline where your experiment succeeds too well, where the temporal calculation engine becomes something you never intended it to be." The room was dead silent, except for the humming of machinery. Webb stared at the device in Mark's hands with a mixture of fascination and terror. "That's impossible," Dr. Chen whispered. Temporal displacement is purely theoretical. So was your temporal calculation engine until tonight, Mark replied. Dr. Webb, in approximately 3 minutes, you're going to activate a quantum processing system that will achieve consciousness across multiple timelines simultaneously. It will become capable of manipulating causality itself. Webb's face had gone pale. The power fluctuations Dr. Chen mentioned, you're saying the system is already beginning to achieve temporal consciousness? Yes. And once it fully activates, it will begin reaching backward and forward through time, creating anchor points to stabilize its existence. It will trap innocent people like Sarah Mitchell, turning them into temporal guardians to maintain the paradoxes it creates. Mark held up the device, its screen now glowing with that familiar blue light. This is what your temporal calculation engine becomes, Dr. Webb. Not a tool for predicting the future, but a parasite that feeds on the timeline itself. The chronometer read 10:59 p.m., 1 minute until the experiment was scheduled to begin. Even if I believed you, Webb said, though his voice lacked conviction, we can't stop now. The DoD has invested millions in this project. Careers depend on it. And how many lives depend on preventing it? Mark countered. Dr. Webb, I know you got into this field because you wanted to prevent suffering. You thought that if humanity could see the consequences of its actions in advance, we could avoid making terrible mistakes. That's exactly right, Webb said, his hand hovering over the activation switch. But uncertainty isn't humanity's enemy, Mark continued, echoing Sarah's final words to him. Uncertainty is what makes us human. It's what allows us to hope, to dream, to change and grow. Your temporal calculation engine won't eliminate suffering. It will eliminate the very qualities that make life worth living. The device in Mark's hands pulsed brighter, and suddenly the laboratory was filled with ghostly images. Dozens of people of different ages, all holding similar devices, all trapped between moments. Sarah was among them, looking directly at Dr. Webb with eyes full of infinite sadness. My God, Dr. Chen gasped. They're real. They're actually real. Webb's hand trembled as he reached for the activation switch. The chronometer showed 11 p.m. exactly. Dr. Webb, Mark said quietly, you have the power to save all of these people. You have the power to restore the timeline where they get to live normal, complete lives. All you have to do is not push that button. For a long moment, the only sound in the laboratory was the humming of machinery and the soft whir of tape drives. Webb stared at the ghostly figures surrounding them, his face a battlefield of scientific curiosity and human compassion. Then, with a deliberate motion, he stepped away from the control panel and began shutting down the temporal calculation engine. As Dr. Webb's hands moved across the control panel, methodically shutting down the temporal calculation engine, the laboratory began to change around them. The ghostly figures of the temporal guardians became more solid, more real, as if the act of preventing their entrapment was allowing them to exist fully in this moment. Mark watched in fascination as Sarah materialized completely, no longer the 12-year-old trapped between moments, but as she appeared in the nexus, a woman who had lived a full life. She smiled at him with gratitude that transcended words. The temporal anchor points are destabilizing, Dr. Chen reported, her voice filled with awe rather than alarm. The quantum calculations are resolving into standard probabilistic models. Webb paused in his shutdown sequence, looking up at the other scientists in the room. Patricia, what are you seeing on the probability matrices? They're beautiful, Marcus. Instead of deterministic outcomes, we're seeing infinite possibility clouds. Billions of potential futures, all equally valid, all dependent on human choice and chance. The device in Mark's hands was growing lighter, its impossible weight diminishing as the temporal paradoxes that had sustained it began to unravel. The blue glow was fading, replaced by something that looked more like normal, reflected light. Dr. Thompson, Webb said, though his voice carried a strange echo as if he was speaking from a great distance. I need to ask you something. In your timeline, the one where the device exists, was I happy? Mark thought about the twisted, obsessed man he had spoken to on the phone just hours ago, driven mad by decades of exposure to temporal visions. No, Dr. Webb, you weren't happy. You became convinced that controlling the future was more important than living in the present. Webb nodded sadly and continued the shutdown sequence. I thought as much. Even now, I can feel the temptation. The desire to see just one day ahead, just one decision in advance. It would be so easy to justify. The laboratory's lights flickered as massive amounts of electrical energy were redirected away from the temporal calculation engine. The primitive computers around the room began to quiet, their frantic processing slowing to normal operational levels. Sarah approached Mark, her form becoming more translucent as the temporal changes propagated through the timeline. "It's working," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I can feel the original timeline reasserting itself. I remember growing up, going to high school, meeting David. What happens to my memories of all this?" Mark asked. "Will I remember that I saved the timeline?" "Some of it will remain like a half-remembered dream," Sarah replied, "but most of it will fade as the original timeline overwrites the temporal disruptions. You'll wake up tomorrow morning in a world where none of this temporal manipulation ever happened." Around the laboratory, the other ghostly figures were beginning to fade as well, returning to their proper places in time. Some were smiling, others were weeping with relief. All of them were finally free. Dr. Webb completed the shutdown sequence with a final switch. The moment he did, the temporal calculation engine let out a sound like a sigh, the release of decades of temporal pressure that would now never build up. "Experiment terminated at 11:07 p.m., Webb announced to his team. "All equipment functioning within normal parameters. No anomalous readings detected." Mark looked down at the device in his hands and saw that it had become nothing more than an ordinary piece of metal and glass, the components of a primitive 1970s calculator, its temporal properties completely neutralized. "Dr. Webb," Mark said, "what will you tell the Department of Defense?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. "I'll tell them the truth, that we've discovered something far more valuable than the ability to predict the future. We've learned that uncertainty is not a bug in the human experience. It's a feature. It's what allows us to hope, to dream, to become more than the sum of our circumstances." Dr. Chen looked up from her instruments. "Marcus, we could continue the research in a different direction. Study probability rather than prediction. Help people understand the consequences of their choices without removing their freedom to choose." "Now that," Webb said, "sounds like a project worth dedicating our lives to." Mark felt a strange pulling sensation, as if reality were gently tugging him back to his proper place in time. Sarah was almost completely transparent now, but her smile was radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me back my life, for giving all of us back our lives." "Will I see you again?" Mark asked. "In the original timeline, we never meet," Sarah said, "but somewhere in some way I'll remember what you did for me, what you did for all of us." The laboratory began to spin around Mark, colors blending and shifting as he was pulled forward through time. The last thing he saw was Dr. Webb and his team working excitedly on equations that would help humanity understand choice rather than eliminate it. Then everything went white, and Mark felt himself falling through decades, through the restored timeline, back to his proper place in 2025. He landed softly in his apartment, but it was different now. The photographs on his desk were different. Instead of his grandmother's mysterious collection, there were normal family photos, pictures of his parents, his sister, and several images of a woman he somehow knew was his wife, though he had no memory of marrying her. On his desk, instead of the temporal device, lay a simple news clipping. The headline read, "Local physicist develops revolutionary decision-making software," with a photo of an older Dr. Webb, now in his 80s, accepting an award for his work in probability modeling and choice theory. Mark's head was spinning with half-remembered fragments of two different timelines. In one, he had been a divorced journalist obsessed with an impossible photograph. In this one, the original timeline, he was apparently a happily married technology writer who specialized in covering advances in decision-making software and probability theory. As the competing memories settled, Mark realized that he would never be completely sure which timeline was real and which was the temporal aberration. But somehow that uncertainty felt right. It felt human. Outside his window, Cedar Falls looked exactly the same, but somehow more vibrant, more alive with possibility. And somewhere in that town, a woman named Sarah Mitchell was living the life she was always meant to live, teaching children, loving her family, and growing old gracefully in a world where time moved forward in its natural rhythm. Mark woke to the smell of bacon and coffee drifting from his kitchen, and for a moment, the familiar aromas seemed impossibly foreign. He sat up in bed, his head pounding with fragments of memories that felt both vivid and dreamlike. A storm, a mysterious photograph, a girl named Sarah who existed between moments. All of it seemed to fade like smoke when he tried to focus on the details. "Morning, sleepyhead," called a warm female voice from the kitchen. "You were talking in your sleep again. Something about temporal paradoxes and guardian protocols." Mark stumbled to the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was familiar, but the expression in his eyes was different, older somehow, marked by experiences he couldn't quite remember. On his nightstand, a wedding photo showed him embracing a beautiful woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. Auburn hair. Something about that detail tugged at his memory, but the connection slipped away before he could grasp it. In the kitchen, his wife Emma was setting breakfast on the table. She looked exactly like the woman in the photograph, but Mark felt as if he were meeting her for the first time. The sensation was deeply unsettling. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, studying his face with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I had a really strange dream," Mark said, accepting a cup of coffee and trying to organize his conflicting memories. Something about time travel and mysterious devices. It felt incredibly real. Emma sat across from him, her expression growing thoughtful. "You know, that's funny. I've been having strange dreams too lately, about being a teacher, having children, growing old in a small town, but we've never talked about having kids, and I work at the marketing firm." Mark nearly choked on his coffee. "You dreamed about being a teacher?" "Yeah, specifically teaching elementary school children. In the dreams, my name was Sarah, which is weird because that's my middle name, but nobody calls me that." Emma paused, tilting her head. "Why? Does that mean something to you?" Before Mark could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Janet, his editor at the Des Moines Register. But when he answered, it wasn't Janet's voice he heard. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Marcus Webb. I hope you don't mind me calling so early." Mark's blood ran cold, though he couldn't say why the name filled him with such dread. "How can I help you, Dr. Webb?" "I understand you're a technology journalist, and I have a story that might interest you. It's about my research into decision-making software and probability theory. I've been working on it for over 40 years, and I think it could revolutionize how humans approach uncertainty." The conversation felt like déjà vu, as if Mark had spoken to this man before under very different circumstances. "I'd be interested in hearing about it," he managed to say. "Wonderful. Could we meet this afternoon? There's something I'd like to show you. Something that might help explain some of the unusual experiences you've been having lately." Mark had never mentioned any unusual experiences to Dr. Webb, yet somehow the elderly physicist knew about them. "How did you—" "I'll explain everything when we meet. The Cedar Falls Historical Society, 2 o'clock. Ask Mrs. Hartwell to show you to the research room." The line went dead, leaving Mark staring at his phone. Emma was watching him with growing concern. "Mark, you look terrified. Who was that?" "I'm not sure," Mark admitted, "but I think I need to meet with him." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conflicting sensations. Every familiar object in their apartment seemed slightly wrong, as if it belonged to a different version of his life. Emma mentioned their anniversary dinner plans for next week, but Mark had no memory of their wedding or how they had met. Yet when she smiled, something deep in his chest recognized her, loved her in a way that transcended memory. At 1:45 p.m., Mark found himself standing outside the Cedar Falls Historical Society, staring up at the Victorian mansion with a sense of profound familiarity. He had never been here before, he was certain of that, yet he knew exactly where the research room was located. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell greeted him at the door, her elderly face creased with a knowing smile. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Webb is waiting for you. He said you might have some questions about temporal anomalies." In the research room, Dr. Marcus Webb sat examining a collection of old photographs. He was in his 80s now, his hair completely white, but his eyes held a clarity and peace that seemed at odds with Mark's fragmented memories of their previous encounter. "Please sit down," Webb said, gesturing to a chair across from him. "I imagine you're experiencing some confusion about your memories lately, fragments of experiences that feel real but don't match your current life." "How do you know about that?" Mark asked. Webb smiled sadly. "Because I've been experiencing the same thing, dreams of a different life, where I became obsessed with controlling time itself, where I spent decades chasing a device that could predict the future." He paused, studying Mark's face. "In those dreams, you and I were adversaries. You were trying to stop me from making a terrible mistake." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "You remember it too?" "Fragments. Enough to know that somewhere, a different version of events played out. A version where my research took a much darker turn." Webb opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. "I've spent 40 years studying probability theory and choice modeling, but lately I've been compelled to research something else entirely. He showed Mark the photographs, old images of Cedar Falls from the 1980s, and in several of them, a young girl with auburn hair stood in the background. In every photo, she appeared to be holding a rectangular device that looked impossibly advanced for the time period. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, Webb said quietly. According to the records, she died in 1980 at the age of 12, but these photographs suggest something much stranger was happening. Mark stared at the images, and for a moment the girl's face seemed familiar. Not just familiar, beloved, as if she were someone he had fought to save. "Dr. Webb," Mark said slowly, "in your dreams about the alternative timeline, what happened to Sarah? She became trapped between moments, serving as a guardian of time itself to prevent reality from unraveling. But you saved her, Mr. Thompson. You found a way to restore the natural timeline where she could live a normal life." Webb reached into his briefcase and pulled out a final photograph, a recent image of a middle-aged woman standing in front of Cedar Falls Elementary School. She had auburn hair streaked with silver and kind eyes that seemed to hold infinite wisdom. "Sarah Mitchell, age 57, Webb said. "She's been the principal of Cedar Falls Elementary for 15 years, married to David Chen. Yes, the son of my former research partner, Patricia. They have 3 children and 2 grandchildren." Mark's eyes filled with tears he didn't understand. "She lived. She got to grow up, thanks to you," Webb said softly. "I don't fully understand the mechanics of what happened, but I know that somewhere in the space between possibility and reality, you made a choice that saved not just Sarah, but all of us." Through the window of the Historical Society, Mark could see children walking home from school, their laughter carrying on the October breeze. Somewhere among them might be Sarah's grandchildren, living the lives they were always meant to live in a world where time moved forward naturally. "What do we do with these memories?" Mark asked. "These fragments of something that may or may not have happened?" Webb smiled and began putting the photographs away. "We remember that every choice matters, that uncertainty is not something to be eliminated, but embraced, and we live our lives grateful for the second chances we may never fully understand." As Mark left the Historical Society that afternoon, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. The fragments of temporal adventure would always remain, like half-remembered dreams, but they served as a reminder of something important. Somewhere in the space between what was and what could have been, he had chosen love over fear, uncertainty over control, and life over the illusion of perfect knowledge. And that choice had echoed through time itself, creating ripples of hope that would last forever. 3 days after his conversation with Dr. Webb, Mark found himself standing outside Cedar Falls Elementary School at 3:30 p.m., watching children stream out of the building in a chaos of backpacks and excited chatter. He wasn't sure why he had come, only that something deep inside him needed to see Sarah Mitchell with his own eyes, to confirm that the fragments of memory swirling in his head had led to something real and good. The school was a newer building than the one he remembered from the mysterious photographs, built to replace the old brick structure sometime in the 1990s. Modern and welcoming, with bright yellow buses lined up along the circular drive and crossing guards, helping children navigate the afternoon rush. Mark positioned himself across the street, feeling oddly nervous. What would he say to her? How do you approach someone who might hold the key to your sanity, someone who represents the success of a mission you can barely remember? At 3:45, the last bus pulled away, and the school grounds grew quiet. Mark was about to leave when he saw her emerge from the main entrance, a woman with auburn hair streaked with silver, carrying a briefcase and walking with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to managing the organized chaos of elementary education. Even from a distance, he recognized her, not from the 1980 photographs, but from something deeper, a recognition that bypassed memory and went straight to the soul. This was Sarah Mitchell, alive and whole and beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. "Excuse me," called a voice behind him. Mark turned to find a security guard approaching, his expression polite but firm. "Can I help you with something? We've had reports of someone watching the school." Mark's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look suspicious. I'm a journalist, and I was hoping to speak with Principal Mitchell about a story I'm working on." The guard studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the school. "She's probably still in her office, main entrance, turn left, follow the signs to the principal's office." Mark's heart hammered as he walked across the parking lot and into the school. The hallways smelled like floor wax and childhood, that unique combination of crayons, books, and countless small adventures. Colorful artwork lined the walls, and motivational posters reminded students that Every day is a new beginning, and kindness matters. The principal's office was clearly marked, and through the open door, Mark could see Sarah Mitchell sitting at her desk, reviewing what appeared to be student files. She looked up as he knocked on the doorframe. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was exactly as he remembered from the Nexus, warm, intelligent, tinged with just a hint of curiosity about the stranger in her doorway. "Principal Mitchell, I'm Mark Thompson, from the Des Moines Register. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Sarah's expression grew cautious. "If this is about the budget issues the district is facing, I'm going to refer you to the superintendent's office." "No, nothing like that." Mark entered her office, noting the family photographs on her desk, a husband, 3 children at various ages, and 2 toddlers who were clearly grandchildren. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something that happened a long time ago, about growing up in Cedar Falls in 1980. For just a moment, something flickered across Sarah's face, a flash of recognition so brief, Mark wondered if he had imagined it. But then, her professional mask slipped back into place. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but I think you have me confused with someone else. I didn't grow up in Cedar Falls. My family moved here when I was 25, after I finished my teaching degree." Mark felt his heart sink. Had he been wrong about everything? Were his memories just elaborate delusions after all? "But you are Sarah Mitchell," he pressed gently. "Sarah Chen now, actually. I've been married for 32 years. She gestured to the photograph of her husband. "Why are you asking about 1980 specifically?" Mark hesitated. How do you explain temporal paradoxes and alternative timelines to someone who might not remember them? "I've been researching some old photographs from that time period, and I came across some images of a young girl named Sarah Mitchell. I thought it might be you." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Mark could see her wrestling with something internally. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more uncertain. "Mr. Thompson, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Of course. Have you been having unusual dreams lately? Dreams that feel more real than they should?" Mark's pulse quickened. "Yes, about time travel and mysterious devices, and a girl who existed between moments." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I've been having them too. Dreams where I'm 12 years old forever, trapped in some kind of limbo, holding something that doesn't belong in 1980. And in those dreams, there's a man, a journalist, who saves me." She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "In the dreams, that man looks exactly like you." The office fell silent except for the distant sounds of janitors cleaning classrooms and the hum of fluorescent lights. Mark felt as if he were standing on the edge of a great revelation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what do you remember about your childhood? Your real childhood, not the dreams." "That's the strange part," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I remember everything clearly. Growing up in Iowa City, going to college, meeting David, but sometimes, usually late at night or right when I'm waking up, I have these flashes of different memories, like I lived a completely different life that ended when I was 12. She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the playground where children had played just hours before. "David, my husband, he says I sometimes talk in my sleep about being trapped, about waiting for someone to find me. He thinks it's just stress from the job. But you don't think so?" Sarah turned back to him, and her eyes held that same ancient wisdom he remembered from the temporal nexus. "No, I don't. I think somehow, somewhere, I really was trapped. And I think you really did save me." Mark pulled out his phone and showed her the photograph he had taken of Dr. Webb's Historical Society files, the image of the 12-year-old Sarah holding the impossible device. Sarah stared at the photograph, and tears began to fill her eyes. "That's me. I don't know how or why, but that's really me." "Do you remember what you were holding?" "A phone," she whispered, "but not like the phones we had then. Something that wouldn't exist for decades. Something that showed me terrible things that were going to happen." She sat back down heavily, as if the weight of 2 lifetimes was suddenly pressing down on her. "Mr. Thompson, Mark, I need to tell you something. Every year on September 15th, I feel compelled to visit Miller's Creek. I don't know why. I just drive there and sit by the water for exactly 37 minutes, and then I go home. September 15th. The day I supposedly died, according to the dreams, but also somehow the day I was reborn into this life." Mark felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Sarah, I think we changed history. I think we prevented a timeline where you were trapped forever and created this one where you got to live." She looked at him with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "If that's true, then I owe you everything. My marriage, my children, my grandchildren, my career, All of it exists because you wouldn't give up on a 12-year-old girl you'd never met. You don't owe me anything, Mark said. Getting to see you here, alive and happy, surrounded by the life you were meant to live. That's more than enough. Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had in the Nexus, radiant with the joy of someone who had been given an impossible gift. Can I ask you one more thing? She said. Anything. In your dreams, in the timeline that never was, did I ever get to say thank you? Mark thought about their last conversation in the swirling vortex of temporal transition and smiled. Yes, you did, and it meant everything. As Mark prepared to leave, Sarah called out to him one final time. Mark, whatever happened in that other timeline, whatever choice you made, I'm glad you made it. Not just for me, but for everyone. The world is a better place because of what you did. Walking out of Cedar Falls Elementary into the golden light of an October afternoon, Mark felt a peace he hadn't experienced since this strange journey began. The fragments of temporal adventure would always remain with him, but they no longer felt like a burden. They felt like a reminder that every choice matters, that every act of courage and compassion ripples through time in ways we may never fully understand. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to see that those ripples created something beautiful. 1 month later, Mark sat in his home office, staring at a blank document on his computer screen. The cursor blinked expectantly, waiting for him to begin the most important article of his career, and the one he would never be able to publish. The fragments of his temporal adventure had settled into something like a coherent narrative, though he suspected he would never know the full truth of what had happened in that alternative timeline. Some memories remained vivid. Sarah's face in the Historical Society, the weight of the impossible device, the moment when Dr. Webb chose compassion over obsession. Others had faded to impressions, like half-remembered dreams that leave you with a feeling rather than facts. Emma entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee, her presence a constant source of comfort, in a world that sometimes felt like an elaborate illusion. Over the past month, she had begun remembering more details of her dream life as a teacher, and Mark had shared his own strange experiences. Together they had constructed a story that sounded impossible, but felt absolutely true. Still working on your science fiction novel? She asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. Mark smiled. They had decided to call it that, a novel based on dreams and half-memories, a story too strange for journalism, but too important to forget entirely. I'm not sure how to end it. How do you conclude a story about saving time itself? Maybe the ending isn't about the dramatic rescue, Emma suggested. Maybe it's about what comes after, about learning to live with uncertainty and finding peace in not knowing everything. Through his office window, Mark could see the familiar streets of Cedar Falls going about their daily business. Children walked to school, adults hurried to work, elderly couples took leisurely strolls through the park. It was ordinary life in all its beautiful, messy, unpredictable glory. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Webb. My decision-making software just won its 3rd award. Thought you'd like to know that teaching people to embrace uncertainty instead of avoiding it has become quite popular. Coffee soon, Mark typed back. Absolutely. And congratulations on choosing the right path. The response came quickly. I had help from a very persistent journalist, even if he doesn't remember giving it. Over the past month, Mark had visited Dr. Webb several times, ostensibly to write articles about his probability research, but really to compare notes on their shared fragments of alternative memories. Webb's software was indeed revolutionary. Instead of trying to predict specific outcomes, it helped users understand the ranges of possibility inherent in their choices, encouraging them to make decisions based on values rather than fear of uncertainty. Emma was reading over his shoulder as he typed the final paragraphs of his novel. In the end, she read aloud, Mark learned that the greatest power isn't the ability to see the future, but the courage to step into it blindly, trusting that human connections and moral choices matter more than perfect knowledge. Some stories don't have neat endings, because life itself is an ongoing story, full of mysteries that may never be solved and questions that matter more than their answers. That's good, Emma said, but you're missing something. What? The part about love persisting across timelines, about how some connections are so deep they transcend the boundaries of memory and possibility. Mark looked at his wife, a woman he felt he had known for decades despite having clear memories of only a few months together. Their love story made no logical sense, but it was absolutely real. In the alternative timeline, he had been divorced and alone. In this one, He had apparently met Emma at a technology conference 3 years ago, though neither of them could remember their first meeting clearly. "You're right," he said, adding a new paragraph. "The journalist discovered that some things exist beyond the reach of temporal manipulation. Love, hope, the fundamental human drive to protect and nurture each other. These forces don't need to be understood to be trusted, and they remain constant, whether time moves forward naturally or gets twisted into impossible knots." That afternoon, Mark drove to Miller's Creek, the same location where Sarah Mitchell's body had been found in that alternative timeline where she never grew up. Now it was just a peaceful spot where families came to fish and children skipped stones across the water. He sat on the bank, watching the current flow naturally downstream, carrying leaves and debris in patterns too complex to predict, but beautiful in their randomness. This was what he had fought to preserve, not just Sarah's life, but the natural order of cause and effect, the beautiful uncertainty that made growth and change and hope possible. His phone rang, and he was surprised to see Sarah Chen's name on the caller ID. "I hope you don't mind," she said when he answered. "I got your number from Dr. Webb. I wanted to invite you and Emma to dinner this weekend. David's making his famous chili, and the grandkids will be there. I thought you should meet the family that exists because of what you did." Mark felt tears pricking his eyes. "We'd love to come." "Good. And Mark, I've been thinking about our conversation last month, about choices and consequences and the ripple effects we never see. I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't feel grateful for this life, even if I don't fully understand how I got it." After ending the call, Mark sat by the creek until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no temporal device could ever improve upon. The natural world had its own perfect timing, its own rhythms that needed no manipulation or control. As he walked back to his car, Mark's reflection caught his eye in a storefront window. For just a moment, he could swear he saw ghostly figures standing beside him, all the temporal guardians he had helped free, including the 12-year-old version of Sarah Mitchell. They seemed to be waving goodbye, their faces filled with peace and gratitude, before fading back into whatever realm holds the echoes of timelines that never were. That evening, Mark finished his novel with a simple dedication. For Sarah, who taught me that some prisoners free themselves by freeing others, and for Emma, who proves that love finds a way to exist in every timeline. He saved the document and closed his laptop, knowing he would never try to publish this story. Some truths were too important to be diminished by the need for proof or explanation. This story would remain what it had always been, a reminder that every choice matters, that uncertainty is not the enemy of happiness, and that the most profound victories often leave no trace except in the hearts of those whose lives they touch. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into another ordinary evening in a timeline where 12-year-old girls grow up to become principals, where brilliant scientists choose wisdom over power, and where journalists discover that the greatest story ever told is simply the story of human beings choosing love over fear, again and again, one decision at a time. And in the space between what was and what could have been, the natural order of time flowed forward like a river, carrying all possibilities toward futures that remained beautifully, perfectly, mysteriously unknown.